Okay, but yesterday we, of course, went over the Mishnah. We spoke about Tosfos. We, we spoke about the Mishnah. The Mishnah had the case of Sukkah Meduvleles, and then the Gemara had a discussion what Meduvleles meant. We had Rabbi Shmuel, and then we had the statement of Abaye and the statement of Rava, where they're explaining Shmuel's view. They're developing what that what the halacha would be with this sukkah meduvleles. It's basically a schach that's alternating. You have some above, some below, more above, more below, more above, more below, and basically the sukkah is seems like it has two layers of schach, and we saw the opinions of Abaye that only if there's within 3 handbreadths, then maybe it could be that would be when it's kosher. If it's more than that, it's 3 or more handbreadths, that would not be kosher. Rava wanted to say that there's a special law called Chavoit Rami. And that's something new that we learned yesterday, this law called Chavoit Rami, very similar to the concept of good aches, that you could lower down a wall that's high, you could extend it. So here also we sort of have a special law about Chavoit Rami, that there's a way of extending or moving something, and we could move the schach to where it either below or above. It's special, like halacha l'baisha misinai, a type of law that even though it's above, we imagine that it's below, and that was a very special, very unique insight, actually, into what it's going to accomplish. So we're going to lower the schach, and we're going to also claim that it's considered more shade than sun, even though physically it's not. But we are imagining, and I see it as almost like it's a 2-step process. That number one, we imagine that the schach is lowered, and then number two, we imagine as if the schach is causing there to be more shade than sunlight. Although you don't necessarily have to look at it that way. You could say, well, it's all about how much schach there is, and if we lower the schach, then you have enough schach. So in other words, this is, it doesn't have to be looked at as 2 steps. It could look at it as it's one thing. Once you lower the schach, so now you have enough schach. In other words, it's not that we are looking to have more shade, it's that we are looking to have enough schach. The point is to have enough schach. So if we lower the schach, now we have enough schach. What is schach? Schach is that it should cause, that there is schach that's capable of causing shade. Anyway, so that's the way Rashi learned it. That even though practically speaking there's a lot of sunlight, but nevertheless we are imagining that the schach is all near each other, and it's enough, it's sufficient to be schach. Tosfos, as we mentioned yesterday, doesn't really go for that. He says if the sun is on top, it is going to be sufficient sunlight, shade, excuse me, from the sunlight, sufficient shade from the sun. And he says it must be that it's a different issue. The problem is that you have 2 separate schachs that each are not considered to have a sufficient amount, and they're not combinable. You can't connect the 2. And that would be the reason, if it's within 3 handbreadths, you could connect the 2. If it's not within 3 handbreadths, then you can't connect the 2. So according to Tosfos, it's not really an issue of the sunlight being too much. It's more of an issue that the shade is not sufficient shade in each of the schachs, and we look at them separately. And unless they're within 3 handbreadths, then we could look at them together.
Rabbi,
Yes.
did you say the emphasis is on the shade as opposed to the schach, or vice versa?
Well, in Tosfos, the emphasis is that the schach be one schach, that the schach is sufficient. And if the schach isn't sufficient, then we can't always combine the 2 schachs. And each schach on its own should be sufficient schach. So it's not that he's worried that you don't have enough shade, because you do have enough shade in the sukkah from both schachs together. But the problem is we look at each schach separately. So practically speaking, you have enough shade. See, Rashi, in his case, the way he sees it, you look at the sun on the side. So the practically speaking, you do have a lot of sunlight. Tosfos's case, he's saying, no, I don't have a lot of sunlight. I'm looking at the sun on top. I don't have a lot of sunlight. I have a lot of shade. But the problem is each of the schachs is not really causing the sufficient amount of shade. It's not sufficient schach. So that's the way, there's a different perspective of how Rashi is seeing it and how Tosfos is seeing it. Now, so the Gemara said that Abaye says that it's specifically talking about a case that's within 3 handbreadths, and then Rava comes along and says, well, you could also have this law of Chavoit Rami. And we mentioned that there's a discussion in the commentaries if Rava is really arguing or he's adding a point. But in any event, Rava does say this new law called Chavoit Rami, and he brings a proof about Chavoit Rami from a Mishnah in Oyalos. And the Mishnah over there in Oyalos talks about the laws of Oyal, a tent. And there are cases there where we are able to say, seemingly we're saying this law of Chavoit Rami in a very similar type of case. Our case is we got a sukkah with schach, and it's alternating schach, above schach, and lower schach. And there they have a case of a 2-story house that it's alternating ceilings. You got a little a board here on the top, then you got a board on the bottom, a board on the top, a board on the bottom. So you got a similar type of a scenario. It actually looks the same if you don't think about it as a dwelling in the top, as the top is like a separate story, but you just look at the fact that there's 2 roofs. So it's very similar. You got 2 schachs and 2 roofs. That's it. Now, what's the law over there? So we had the law that we say Chavoit Rami over there. What do? We actually lower the upper ceiling to be as if it's lowered and it fits right in to the lower ceiling. So the empty spaces on the lower ceiling are filled in with the upper ceiling. And then we have a oil, and that oil will actually disperse the impurity throughout the entire tent. Even though it sounds surprising, the roof is not exactly flush. It's some is above, some is below, and so how is it considered one big roof? You would think that it's separate things. You have impurity under one beam. That beam is a tent, not the whole roof. And yet we say no. We have Chavoit Rami. We put it. We connected the whole roof, and it's all considered one big tent. And we could say this special law and make it one big tent. Everything is going to be tamei under it, and then above it, of course, once it's an oyel, it blocks the impurity from going above. So the impurity stays below, it stays in the oyel, it doesn't go above. And then you have this Chavoit Rami, and we can say the same thing about schach, that you have some schach above, some schach below, it's alternating. And we could do the same thing of Chavoit Rami. And he says, however, there is one law that you have to know. It's yesh bahen tefach. that there is a tefach of space, that the upper board has to be at least a tefach, a handbreadth. That's the caveat of the rule of this chavoit rami. Okay, so that's pretty much where we got up to yesterday. Any questions? Okay, let's continue then. I'm going to read that Mishnah one more time. Yes, David.
Are you saying that there has to be a space between the upper schach and the lower schach?
No, I was talking about how thick the board has to be.
Oh, okay. That's what I thought. I mean, I didn't think it was the other. It didn't make any sense. I wasn't sure what the space was you were talking about.
Yeah, no, how thick the upper schach has to be. Okay, let's read it.
Yeah, but if you're looking for thick, it could be a foot thick or 2 feet thick. You don't want to like that, do you?
I don't necessarily mean thickness, the height thickness. I mean the width of it.
That's even worse. If you have a piece of schach that's 2 feet or 3 feet or 4 feet wide,
right.
That's no good.
Why not?
Because
why
then
not?
Because it's like a roof of a house.
Oh, you're thinking of it as like a typical roofing board. I'm just using that. Let's say it's a branch, so then it's not like a roof of a house. So then it would be fine. If it was actually wood, a wood board, you're right. You could have a problem. We had a Mishnah about it. Meir, Rabbi Yehuda. We did discuss that. But let's just say schach. That's not a board. It's not used for roofing. So then you wouldn't have this issue. It's like a mat. Mat is very nice and big. You got a 10-foot mats by 10 by 12s, or 12 by 12. Yeah, they make some nice big mats out there. That's not a problem for schach. I mean, at least according to the Hechsherim.
But are they considered solid, or there's spaces in between of each bamboo reed or each piece of wood?
If they make it very tight, listen, officially rain has to be able to come through. But as we saw in our Mishnah, even if you can't see the stars, okay. So if it's quite tight, rain will still get through that. It might take a little while, but rain will get through it. But even if it's quite tight, it should be kosher. I mean, the mats, they try to make it tight. They don't do such a great job, but it would seemingly be fine, even if it was tight.
I mean, did we learn before about something like a door? If you put a door as schach, isn't that the puzzle?
Well, a door would have a problem. I mean,
it's a keli.
What we learned about doors with regard to the paraduma. I don't know if you're connecting that with the sukkah. You know what I mean? I think you might be confusing it with the paraduma cases.
Okay.
I don't know if we connected doors to sukkah. It doesn't seem like there would even be room to begin to permit a door on them, right? Am I right? Do we talk about doors on schach?
I remember doors being used for something.
Yeah, no, that was the paraduma, the red heifer.
Okay.
Okay, so the Gemara here. Let's do the Mishnah. Let's read the Mishnah in. Let's learn again the Mishnah in Oyalis. So we're going to start Ditnan. I'll start 2 lines before that. Amar Rava. I think that's the easiest. We'll start Amar Rava. This is the second Amar Rava on the page. The Amar Rava is maybe about 18 lines from the top. Amar Rava, Mana Amina Lahu. So we're in 22a, 18 lines from the top. Amar Rava, Rava says, Mana Amina Lahu, law, Mana Amina law. How do I, from where am I saying this? The is but tefach, that when it has a handbreadth, Amrinan Chavait Rami, we can say the special law called Chavait Rami. V'chiles le, v'chiles be, or v'chiles ba, lo Amrinan Chavait Rami. If it doesn't have the handbreadth, you don't say Chavait Rami. Now, what this means is that the upper schach, or the in the case of a sukkah, is the upper schach needs to have at least the width of a handbreadth. And he brings a proof from Mishnah, because we learned in a Mishnah in Oilis, Kuris Habayis, you have these beams of the house or boards of the house, the aliyah and of the attic, second floor. Sheina Leia Maziva, they don't have this building, this roofing material, which is basically some type of a tar or some type of cement that they would use to smear, as the. But here it doesn't have it. It's basically just as some boards. So my understanding is he's in the middle of building his house. It's not yet finished. The problem is this impurity. So you have the upper roof, partial roof, and the lower partial roof. And they are corresponding to each other. That means that the first floor roof and the second floor roof are exactly one on top of the other. There's one board here. It's exactly 5 inches from the edge, and the upper roof is the same thing. It has a board that's 5 inches from the edge, and then there's empty space on the top and on the bottom, and then you have another board. So it's mechuvanos. All of these boards are mechuvan. They're corresponding to the for both floors. So tumatach zachs behen. So when you have impurity under one of them, tumatachas achas behen tachtehotami. So if there's impurity under one of them, so under it is impure. Bein tachtoina lo. You know what happens if there's impurity in between the two boards, the first floor ceiling and the second floor ceiling. In between them is some type of impurity, a kazayas, let's say an olive size of dead body or of blood or something, that would cause an oil that could be tame with the tumas oil that causes a tuma with the tent. So if you have impurity in between, so beinei tummy, anything that's there, anything else that's in between these two boards is going to be tummy, impure. Agabihol yoina. So what happens if you have something impure on top of the second floor roof, and on top of one of those boards on the second floor roof, you have something impure? So connect tummy from it all the way up to heaven is impure. Now, what happens if they are not corresponding to each other? Instead, they are alternating, similar to the case of our Mishnah, where you have alternating schach. So this case was similar. It has alternating roofs. You have a top, one on the top of board. Now there's empty space, but on the bottom there's a board, and then on the top then after you finish that bottom board and the empty space on top, you have a board and under that board it's empty space on the bottom. And then and you keep alternating. Put one board on top, one board on the bottom, one board on top. So here you have alternating roofs. And so then what's the din when there's impurity? So this is the case called El Yoinais Kavein Hatachtonis. The top ones are corresponding to what's in between the bottom ones. They're corresponding to the airspace in between the bottom ones. So Tuma Tachtehen, so when there's impurity under them, and that means that on the lower level, there's some impurity. So the law is Tachas Kulan Tame. Anywhere on the bottom, you have impurity, even if it's under the upper roof. If you have impurity, we consider the whole area tame. It's one big tent. Tachas kulan is tame. Under all of them are tame. Al gabehan, what happens if you have impurity above the top of them, of the upper roof. So Kenegda Ad Larakia is Tameh. So from it until the heavens is impure.
If it's where? On top of the two roofs?
If it's on top, yeah.
So if it's on top of the two roofs.
Or which would mean either one of them. If it's on top of the bottom roof, because there's nothing blocking it to the sky, or on top of the
Then
top
you have
roof.
the top roof. But if you have the top roof, what's
alternating.
Tameh?
So only
Until Shemayim.
from anything that goes over that, if anything ever goes over that piece of Tumah, it'll be Tameh. There's no tent, but whatever goes over
right.
it will be Tameh with it itself will be the considered
over the object itself.
Over the object, that's impure.
Right.
So Kenegda Ad Larakia is Tameh. The Tumah is there. Anything that goes over will receive that Tumah. The impurity is there. It shoots up. And anything that goes above it is impure. There's nothing to block that impurity. Now, what's the reason for this? The reason for this law, like this second case, the first case was that the bottom roof corresponds to the top roof. So then we understood there's oil and each thing is an oil and goodbye. It's understandable. But what about the second case that we said is the elyones kavena tachtones, that the top roof is corresponding to the airspace below that's in between the two bottom boards. That's what the top roof corresponds to, the airspace. So in that case, very surprising that the tumah, the impurity, spreads throughout the entire structure. How could that be? Why is that? So the answer is it's called chavoit rami. So Vatani Allah, and we learned on this that there's a certain qualification for this to be the case. We learned on this in a brisa that or Tosefta that Bamed Dvarim Amurim. When does this apply? Bisman sheish behen tefach, when they are a size of a handbreadth. Uveinein peiseach tefach, and in between them there is a tefach, which basically means that the bottom boards, meaning the roof of the first floor, they themselves are the size of a tefach, the boards, and in between them there is the size of a handbreadth, which basically means that above that is the size of a handbreadth. And there's a discussion in the commentaries about the exact qualifications. In other words, the Mishnah here, or the Tosefta here, I should say, is emphasizing what? That the space in between has a handbreadth. And what did we say earlier? The emphasis was that on top should be a handbreadth. At the top, what did Rava say? And Rava said that so before he uses the words begagoy, it needs to have a handbreadth. Here he seems to be saying that the empty space is a handbreadth. So there's a discussion in the Rishonim. To what extent do we follow both? Do you need both to have the handbreadth? Or it could be that the fact that it just says that the airspace on the bottom is a handbreadth is just implying that the top roof, the size of those boards, are handbreadth by the size of a handbreadth because it's corresponding to that space. So not emphasizing it exactly. It's not saying it so clearly, but that's what the point is. There are Rishonim that say no, you actually need to have a space that's a handbreadth also. The space has, but you could learn it that it doesn't mean that it has to be a handbreadth space. It's just it mentions it should have a handbreadth space because that's the meaning that above it, the board above it is going to have a handbreadth space. I'm just sharing with you just so that you don't get confused by the fact that before we emphasized the board on top has the width of a handbreadth, and here we're emphasizing that the space has a width of a handbreadth. And there's basically two ways of learning that. It could mean that yes, that's right, you need both of them, Or it could be that the bottom handbreadth is just signifying that the top board has that size of a hand.
A width of a handbreadth or a height of a handbreadth?
No, the width. We're only talking about the width. We're not talking about how thick it is here. Okay, so but I'm going to start again from this V'tani Allah, the Tosefta. So the Tosefta says, "Bamed dvarim amurim." When does this apply? That we actually look at this as one oihel, 1/10. When does it apply? Bizman sheish ben tavach ubenein. Bizman sheish bahen tavach. When the boards themselves have a handbreadth, and ubenehen, and in between them, meaning the space in between the boards on the lower the lower roof, which is the ceiling to the first floor, when that has in between the boards, and a space, an open space of a handbreadth. If it doesn't have this empty space of a handbreadth, so then it's going to have a different law. Now you have alternating roofs, and they don't have a handbreadth. What's going to be the law? So
one roof.
Then the Brisa says this is if it doesn't have the Pesach Tevach, so Tuma Tachas Achas Mehen. So if there's impurity under one of these beams, the whole structure is not going to be Tameh. It's Tachteha Tameh. Under it, one second. Okay, so I have to emphasize one point here because otherwise you get stuck. They don't have a handbreadth in between on the bottom boards, which also means that the top boards don't have the size of a handbreadth. But what about the bottom boards? The bottom empty spaces don't have a handbreadth. What about the bottom boards? So that's where you gotta spell this out. Again, let me just read it inside. If you don't have an empty space of a tefach, it doesn't say if the boards don't have the handbreadth. It means if the empty spaces on the first floor of the first floor ceiling, if that first floor ceiling doesn't have empty space of a handbreadth, which automatically means that the top boards also don't have a handbreadth of space, but the bottom boards do have a handbreadth of space. So if it's tuma tachas achas mehen, if there's impurity under one of the bottom boards, then there's a handbreadth of space on those bottom boards. The in-between space is not a handbreadth, but the bottom boards has a handbreadth, the width of a handbreadth. So and there's impurity under them, then under those boards, under that one board, I should say, is going to be tameh, impure, because that is an oihel. So that's the now what happens beinehen? What happens if you have in between the bottom boards in the top boards, or I'm sorry, beinehen, and what's going to be in between the bottom boards and the top boards, which would mean in the case where they're one on top of the other, then the tumah is under the bottom one. That's an oihel that blocks the impurity from going above. And so also al gabeim, and also anything that's above, in a case where you don't have the corresponding boards and you just have the sky, So any vessel that's above it, above this board, that's the ceiling. So it's all going to be tahor. It's going to be pure. Why? Because the bottom boards have a handbreadth that, number one, makes anything else under it impure, and number two, it blocks the impurity from going above it. And therefore, it doesn't matter if there's a second roof on top or the second roof is on the side of it. None of that is going to make a difference. This is going to block that impurity. And so that's the Mishnah and the Brisa in Oyalos, the Mishnah and the Tosefta in Oyalos, which basically spells out this law of Chavoit Rami. What comes out from this whole thing? That number one, there's a law called Chavoit Rami, and number two, which is what Rava really wanted to emphasize, is that you need to have on the top, it needs to have a tefach in order to be considered that we lower it down and make it part of this schach. So the roof, and the same law would apply to schach, that it has to at least have a handbreadth. Each of these pieces of schach should at least be a handbreadth. That's this law of Chavoit Rami. Okay, Alma, we see ki isbei tevach amrinon Chavoit Rami, v'chi lesbei tevach lo yamrinon Chavoit Rami. We see that if it has a handbreadth, we say Chavoit Rami. If it doesn't have a handbreadth, we don't say Chavoit Rami. Shma mina. We see this from here. Case is closed. This is it's a proof, and that's Rava's claim. However, comes along Rav Ashi, and Rav Ashi is going to ask a question on this. Rav Kahana says this thing, and Rav Ashi comes and asks a question. We have another place where it seems in the laws of Shabbos and Eruvin, seems that you don't need to have a tefach. So that's the question on this. Let's continue. Yosef, Rav Kahana sat down, and he said this law, he taught this rule. Amar le Rav Ashi le Rav Kahana, and Rav Ashi said to Rav Kahana, and really, and anytime you don't have a handbreadth, the width of a handbreadth, you can't lower the upper thing to lower it and make it chavoit, to do the chavoit Rami law. You can't do that. Doesn't have a handbreadth. You won't say chavoit Rami in such a case. It has to have the width. Are you sure? V'hatanya, didn't we learn? Wasn't it taught in a brisa? Kaira, when you have a beam, that goes out of one wall, and this is talking about where you have, with regard to the laws of Shabbos, you have three walls of a courtyard, and or a what should I say, a mavo, not more than a courtyard. It's a alley. You have three walls of an alley, not a courtyard. It's a mavo. It's an alley that has three walls. And according to the rabbinic decree, you need to do something for the fourth wall to make it that it's considered closed off. And what do you need to do? So what you need to do is either put some type of a board that goes from the first wall to the third wall, and that board would go, let's say, on top by the first wall and the third wall, and it would be a considered like a machitza, like a imaginary fourth wall. The other option is you make a lechi, which would be a pole next to one of either the first wall or the third wall, and that pole would be a heker, would be recognizable that this is meant to be closed off, and that would be also an option. So the law is that how thick does this beam have to be, which we're calling a kaira, the beam that goes across, and does it have to reach both ends? Does it have to go from the first wall all the way to the third wall or not? And we learned this once before in this Masechta. So it says, we learned in a Brisa, when you have kaira hayotzim kaisel zeh, a beam that goes from one wall, ve'ena naigas b'kaisel zeh, but it doesn't reach the other wall. So you have in this alley 3 walls, and you want to close off and make a 4th wall, but the problem is your beam is not long enough. So you put the beam on top of or connected to the 3rd wall, and it's supposed to reach the first wall, or the first wall to the 3rd wall, and it doesn't. There's an empty space. So if it's not reaching there, and similarly, if you have another case where you have 2 half poles, you have 2 poles. That one starts at one wall, and it goes to try to close off this 4th wall, and then you put the other small beam from the other side, and you're hoping that they're going to meet in the middle, but they don't. There's empty space. One goes out of one wall, and one goes out from the other wall. And they don't touch each other. So again, you got 3 walls. The first wall and the 3rd wall, you're trying to attach those 2 walls by making some type of a 4th wall. So you put some beam there, but it doesn't reach, or you have 2 half beams and they don't reach each other. So pachos mishloisha eina tzarich lavi kara cheres. If it reaches within 3 handbreadths, it's good enough. That's called the law of love. Shloisha, if it's the space that's 3 handbreadths or more, sarich lahavi kaira acheres. You're going to need to bring a new beam in order to make it kosher. There's this 2 beams or this 1 beam that's not long enough. It doesn't do anything. It's not accomplishing what you want it to accomplish. So you're going to have to get another beam. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says,
it's interesting. A lechi is a vertical pole.
Right.
There's absolutely nothing going across to show that it goes across to the other side. But 2 beams across the top, which definitely shows an entranceway, but if they don't touch within 3 tvachim, it doesn't count.
Right. I'm sure we would go into this more if we're learning Eruvin. It's definitely an interesting thing, and the understanding I have is that you're trying to make a mechitza, but you didn't. If you were trying to make a hecker, you could have accomplished it. But the law of hecker is it has to be on the side. In other words, the hecker on the side would have worked. But because you're doing it as a mechitza, you're trying to do this as a wall, not just as something recognizable. So because you're doing it as a wall, this is not a wall. If you put it on the side, it would have worked. You could have put a vertical beam along the side, and that would have been recognizable as a hecker.
The lefty was obviously such an important. It was like a barbershop pole. It was immediately recognizable as.
Yeah, that is interesting that the barbershops have their symbol. So yeah, there's a good example of the lechi. Anyway, so Reb Shimon ben Gamliel has an interesting rule that I don't think we've ever seen before, and I don't think most people are familiar or aware of this. And we don't hold like this. But Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, "Hachos me'arba einay tzarech lahavi kaira acheres." He says that.
Page.
We turn the page. Yes, 22b now. For those that just woke up, 22b. So the Reb Shimon ben Gamliel has this interesting law. He says that even if you're 4 handbreadths too short, if you're less than 4 handbreadths too short, it's okay. But once you reach 4 handbreadths, that's the cutoff point. That's the threshold. It's 4 handbreadths of empty space. That's not good. Why does he hold this way? Because Reb Shimon ben Gamliel holds that lavud is 4 handbreadths, not 3 handbreadths. Anyone ever heard of that? This is a new opinion that very unknown. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, he holds the law of lavud is a law of 4 handbreadths. We've always learned that it's 3 handbreadths. That's the halacha. But Reb Shimon ben Gamliel has an interesting rule. He holds that it's 4 handbreadths, and therefore, when it comes to the laws of making this 4th wall for Eruvin, that some type of hecker recognition that it's a wall or that it's closed off, it's not meant for public as a public domain. So he holds that as long as the beam reaches up to 4 handbreadths, that's good enough. Not like we hold up to 3 handbreadths, he holds up to 4. And once it is, but if it's 4 handbreadths of empty space, then you're going to need to bring tzarech lahavi kaira acheres. If it's arba'ah, if it's 4 handbreadths, then you're going to need to bring another beam to make it kosher because your beam is too short. Yes, Jeffrey.
So we did see this before. We saw that if you had a board to put on the top of the sukkah, that there was a limitation of 4 handbreadths. And then they argued that you want to come close to that, that therefore it shouldn't be more than 3. But it's still, the comparison is exactly parallel to that. Correct. Even if you put them on their sides, stood them up, and we couldn't use anything that was 4 handbreadths wide, but 3 was okay. And
so
therefore,
you're right that the number 4 has come up before, but not with regard to the law of lavud. You're correct that there is a many legal rules about 4, but the concept of lavud being the law of being 4, that to me is something very new. Did you learn lavud was 4, or did you learn that he has other halachas that apply to sukkah and apply other places that there are 4? But to say that the law of lavud, that something is not there, there's empty space, and we attach something that's close to it, as long as it's within 4 handbreadths, that is that's a law of lavud. For example, there's a law that schach is non-kosher schach up to 4 handbreadths, and I think that's right. You're quoting, that's also kosher, but that's not because of the law of lavud. That's not why it's kosher. It's because it's not a significant amount, and therefore not taking up a shear of a significant amount. Therefore, we're able to permit that sukkah. That sukkah is still kosher. However, when it comes to empty space, that's where you use the law of lavud that we attach it to. We're not saying that with regard to non-kosher schach. A non-kosher schach, we're saying it's not that we're attaching the non-kosher schach to the kosher schach and saying lavud. It's that we're saying that it's considered batel to the rest. It's a different rule that it's permitting that non-kosher schach. Lavud applies when it's empty space, and empty space. So that to me is this is a new law that not a well-known opinion, but unless you can prove to me that the other cases that we've seen for the number 4 is falls into the category of lavud, I don't think so. I didn't learn it that way.
No, but there seems to be this dispute that's parallel, that 3 is recognizably not something that you'd use to put on your normal roof, and 4 was something you would put on your normal roof. And that was one of the reasons why
so now you're talking about the boards that are similar to a roof. Okay. So the boards similar to a roof, that was more of a rabbinic decree. It's also not connected to the law of lavud. It's about a rabbinic decree that we want the person not to make a mistake, or people shouldn't think that you're allowed to use your house, and you could use, for a sukkah. or other people will make the mistake, or you'll make a mistake and think that your house is also a kosher sukkah. But again, I don't think that's connected really to the law of Lovin. But what I will say is that the idea of Reb Shimon ben Gamliel might be, you might have a point that his reasoning of Lovin might be connected to the idea that 4 is considered a makom chashuv. So he might learn the law of Lovin. Maybe, it's a halacha l'maisha Sinai, but maybe it's somehow connected to this idea that 4 is considered a makom chashuv, and he understands that the halacha l'maisha Sinai must be that Lovin works only in that scenario where it's less than 4, because otherwise 4 is considered a makom chashuv. Maybe the reasoning might be similar. In other words,
maybe it's a good thing to remember that in 3 different cases, 3 and 4 are the question of
a lot of numbers. It's almost like Pesach. You have 3 matzahs and you have 4 cups of wine. You see the 4 questions and the 4 children, the 4 sons.
Everything's 4.
Everything's either 3 or 4. In Judaism,
I vote for 4.
Kayin, Levi, Yisrael. You have the 3. Right. So, but anyway, yeah, there's definitely connections between these numbers. But I'm admitting to you that maybe there is a similarity here between Reb Shimon ben Gamliel in these other cases that you brought up, because it could be that his reasoning is based on the concept of 4 being a makom chashuv. Again, we'd have to learn where he talks about this case. Maybe it discusses it in Eruvin and explains his reasoning. But anyway, it's not really applicable to our Gemara. Just an interesting opinion on the side.
But here we do have something very interesting, because the roof that's over and the roof that's under are combining with 3 tefach space and alternating, and then everything underneath.
Well, now you're jumping ahead. We'll see what you're saying soon. It's
Okay.
a little ahead of us. So let me first read it inside. Yes, David.
You're talking about halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Is there a finite number, or is there it sounds like there's an infinite number every time you come to something that's not clear? The person says, "Oh, it's a halacha l'Moshe Sinai."
Oh.
I think you searched it up or something online. I think a little while back. You came up with some finite numbers. I'm sure it must mention there Chavoit Rami. If you want to search it again, I would think that this is mentioned. This would be one of those things mentioned there. If not, then it's considered part of the other halacha Sinai of good alches mechitzasa. Maybe it might be connected to that other halacha Sinai. But I would guess it would be. It would be written there among that list.
Okay, I'll check it out. Yeah. Right, thank you.
So let's continue over here. We're on 22b, and now we come to the main purpose of bringing this brisa. Again, why are we bringing this brisa? We're going to try to prove, and it's the statement of Rava was that in order to say Chavoit Rami and lower something that's above, make it lowered to fit right in, to make a tent and make a sukkah, make an oihel, that we're going to lower things that are on top to an empty space that's below. That's called Chavoit Rami, that we lower something, make it into a tent. So that law only applies if the boards above are the width of a handbreadth, then we will lower them. If they're less than the size of a handbreadth, we won't lower them. That was Rava's statement. And here comes Rav Ashi, and he says, I don't know if that's correct. Even if it's less than the size of a handbreadth, I think we also say Chavoit Rami. And why does he think so? So we brought a whole brisa here about these laws of Eruvin. We spoke about beams, and if they don't reach the end of the other wall, we're trying to close off a 4. And now comes the question, v'chein, and similarly, what happens if you want to make a beam to close off the fourth wall and it's not thick enough? Because the beam that closes off the fourth wall, in order to be considered a mechitza, sort of like a separation, that it's not part of the public domain, you want to close it off, it needs to have a tefach, a handbreadth. What happens if you don't have, a handbreadth is 3 inches, a little over 3 inches. And what happens if you're using a 2x4? A 2x4 only has 1.5 inches, the width. And you need to have 3 inches. So could you use a little over 3 inches? So the question, wait, say that again?
2x4.
By 4, but let's say we're looking at the
You're
width.
putting it on the two sides.
On the two side.
They're not really 2x4. They're
Right,
one
and even a
and
2x4
something, and then two and something, and
even
three
a
and something.
2x4, yeah, even a 2x4 is not 2 inches by 4 inches. It's really 1.5 or something like that by 3.5. But anyway, so the bottom line is that you don't have the 4x4 beam that would be nice to have here for your mechitza. And to close off, to be considered a koira real beam, you only have a 2x4. So the question is, could you maybe put two together? And then you'll have, possibly it'll be sufficient, be a little over 3 inches, should be maybe good enough. So the brisa continues, v'chein shtei koiros, hamatimos, you have two beams that are matimos, they're close to each other, almost like twins. I think teumais means twins. So they're matimais. They're fitting. They fit right. They're both next to each other. They're tight. They're tight next to each other, and loy bazu kadei lakabel ariach, v'loy bazu kadei lakabel ariach. Neither of them are thick enough to receive a half a brick, and the ariach is a type of brick that's like the hat. It's a real brick. A levena would be 3 handbreadths by 3 handbreadths. An ariach is the half of levena, is a half a brick. So instead of it being 3 by 3 handbreadths, it's 1.5 by 3 handbreadths. So the rule of a koira of this beam, it's supposed to be able to hold an ariach. How would it hold an ariach? Ariach is 1.5, and this beam that you were using to close off an alley, a mavui, an alley for an eruv, we're using a beam. The law is it has to be 1 handbreadth. What do you mean? How could 1 handbreadth is going to handle a handbreadth and a half brick? And the answer is yes, that it's okay if a little sticks out on this side or on that side. 1 handbreadth is good enough. So now what happens if you have these two beams that neither of them on their own are sufficient because they don't have a tefach, they don't have a handbreadth, so they're not sufficient to hold an ariach, which is 1.5 tefachs by 3. They're not sufficient to hold it. So it says in Makablis Ariach L'Rachvai, if both of them together, there you put their widths together, and they're able to be a tefach, to handle this ariach, to handle this a brick, this 1.5 side, half, call it a half a brick. So in Makablis Ariach L'Rachvai tefach, which means that if they could handle the ariach placed the width side of it, which means the 1.5 tefach size, so it could be placed on top of them, and they together are a tefach. So then ein tzarich lavi karacheres, you don't have to bring another beam. Those two beams, those two 2x4s should be good enough. V'im lav, but if they don't reach even the size of a tefach, so they're not able to handle a riach, so then tzarich lahavi karacheres, you have to bring another beam. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says Im mekablois ariach la'arkai. Rav Shimon Gamliel says, if you place these two 2x4s, these two beams, you place them with a little space in between, and then what you would do is put the half a brick partially on one, partially on the other. So then there's empty space in between. So you put the end of it on one beam, on one 2x4, and you put the other end of it on the other 2x4, and you got a little less than 3 handbreadths in between. So if you put it, because the ariach size is 3 handbreadths, so im mekables ariach la'arka, if it can handle the length of the ariach to its to the ariach's length, so shleisha tfachim, 3 handbreadths. So then, ein tzarech lavi karacheres. You don't have to bring another beam. V'im lav tzarech lavi karacheres. If not, then you would need to bring another beam. In other words, as long as it could handle, according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, if it could handle putting the separating these two 2x4s and putting the brick from one to the other, and they could hold it, then it's considered good enough. It's considered a mechitza. Now it's within 3 handbreadths of each other, and could handle this ariach, they could handle this brick. It's kosher. Achas l'mayla v'achas l'mata. Here comes the juicy part.
How about Rami?
If one is above, one 2x4 is above, in one v'achas lamata, one is below, and together they will be a tefach, so they could handle this half a brick, and they're not exactly one on top of the other. They're more like one next to the other. So it's achas l'mayla v'achas lamata. One is above, one is below. Rabbi Yosi, Rabbi Yehuda, Aimer, Ryan, Hol, Yaina, Kilu, Hi, Lamata. We look at, imagine the top one as if it's below. V'es hatachtoina, Kilu, Hi, Lamaylam. We look at the bottom one as if it's above. We put them together. And guess what? We now have a tefach, a handbreadth. Uvelvad, as long as as long as the top one is not too high, it's not above 20 cubits, like lamata, me'asara, and the bottom one isn't too low, as long as they're within kosher height to be considered a kaira, to be considered a wall for this 4th wall for your mavi, for the alley, in order to make it possible for an eruv, a shitufei mavuais, that the shituf, that the different courtyards can join together and walk and carry into this alley. So in order to do that, so as long as they're within the kosher height for such a closing off of a 4th wall, then it's okay. So what do we see? That you can attach something that's above less than a handbreadth to something that's below less than a, make a handbreadth out of it. Do we say chavayit rami even if it's not a handbreadth? Of course, because if it was a handbreadth, you wouldn't need to attach the 2 things. You could just use the top one. It must be that it's less than a handbreadth. If it's less than a handbreadth, you see that you say chavayit rami, that we lower the top beam to be connected to the bottom beam, even though it doesn't have a handbreadth. Because that's the whole idea here. We're trying to attach it to make it a handbreadth, and we're using chavayit rami to make something less than a handbreadth into considered to be the size of a handbreadth. So here also with schach, we could say the same thing maybe, that the upper schach, you have lower schach, and even though the upper one doesn't have the size, the width of a handbreadth, we should be able to lower it, chavayit rami, even if it's not the size of a handbreadth. So that is the question that Rav Ashi is asking. And we are going to stop here. Sei gesund, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you, Rebbe. Thank you all.